So we're going to do a bit of a presentation kind of to start. And then I'm going to do a mock interview with Jenny so that you can kind of get an idea as to what to actually expect and kind of see what the process really is like. So maybe if I can get some slides up on the screen and I can start a little bit of our intro. So a technical interview is, oh, I think I lost my slides. There we go. What is a technical interview? So a technical interview is a special type of interview where you're either testing your coding skills or your problem solving skills. They're usually conducted if you're wanting to join a technical team. And so what that means is, like, if you're joining an engineering team, wanting to become a programmer, those are the type of interviews you'd have. The purpose of the technical interview isn't really to trick you. So it's not meant to be like brain teasers or impossible questions you can't beat. They're really meant to be like real world problems that you might actually be facing on that job. So if your team is working on like creating user profiles, they might be asking you to kind of create a user profile. Technical interviews can kind of go one of two ways. They can either do a whiteboarding problem or you can do a coding challenge. And so coding challenges tend to be things you would do like later on. So don't worry too much about that when you're just starting out in your career. You'll probably end up with more of the whiteboarding problems. But coding challenges can either be like a homework style or they can be a pair programming style. So done in the interview or done before an interview. Even though you're interviewing like in a tech job and it can be really intimidating, if you actually do some practice and get prepared, you can kind of get an idea of what to expect. So whiteboard interview exercises are kind of designed to better understand the potential hire that is approaching this problem. So when you are asked to do a whiteboarding exercise, the questions are kind of big and open-ended, and there's no right or wrong answer. That's not the idea. The idea, and even if you do like solve the problem, even though there's no right or wrong answer, the interviewer will actually probably continue to extend the solution in order to keep you talking and to keep you understanding how you're thinking. So the general strategy is to take that big problem and to break it down into smaller chunks and solve those smaller chunks individually and just continuously think out loud. So understanding the problem is key. So we recommend repeating the required, like the requirements, and repeating the question back so that make sure you understand that question before you start. And then, start thinking of the users, start thinking of the use cases for that, and then kind of move on to more things like the data, the algorithms, and the user interfaces. But always communicate your assumptions or the risks. So another type of technical interview, as I mentioned before, is the coding style interview. And that's when you're typically producing code either in a written language of your choice or a choice for something that's been presented beforehand to you. And it can be done at home, and so you have a bunch of time to do it, or it can be done in the interview where you have a set amount of time to do it. And there's a few different techniques you can do to tackle that, but don't worry about that in this part of your career. That's more of something you'll come in later in your career. So don't worry too much about this now. So an interview can always be intimidating. And I know that. I get nervous in interviews. Even as the interviewer, I get nervous. So don't worry. And interviewers can be very different. So some of them have lots of experience coding interviews and doing interviews, conducting them, when others might be really new to the process. So every interview is going to be different. Some interviewers like myself can be really talkative and collaborative. I tend to be an extroverted person and talk a lot, when other people are very quiet and they're much more shy. And so it really depends on their personality. And I wouldn't worry too much about if an interviewer is quiet, because that doesn't mean you're doing a bad job. That might be very much based on their personality. So let's talk about tips for interviewing. So always be talking. The whole point of this interview is to get into your brain and to understand how you think. So we encourage you to talk through that process. And if you can talk through that process, you kind of get these like added bonus where the interviewer can steer you into the direction they want you to be moving in with that question. Listen to the interviewer. That's another one. Especially when they're introducing the problem, you want to make sure you capture all of it. And they're there to help you, so you can ask them those questions back if you don't quite understand. And that actually leads me to my next point. Ask questions. This is so important. Asking questions and understanding the problem is number one. And you just want to make sure you're always on the same page and make sure you don't make any assumptions. and don't steer you into the wrong direction. If they're kind of trying to get you into one way, you want to make sure you're following that way with them. So what if you don't actually know something? That's actually okay. Showing determination and grit goes a long way, but honesty is kind of the best policy. If you don't know something, don't be afraid to say, I don't know. The interviewer can help you and get you on track if they think they need to, or kind of help with a different question, or get to know your thought process in another way. And take your time. Whiteboarding problems aren't meant to be fully solved. So don't feel like you need a fully fledged app if they've asked you to build an app. That's not the idea. But on the flip side, just make sure that you do keep an eye on the time, so that when you're going through and answering all the questions, you have answered everything. So how to prepare. Practicing for whiteboarding interviews is really key for this style thing. Also making lists of questions. Maybe you learn about the team and you're really interested in maybe like the financial aspect of what the team is doing. So maybe they're taking credit card payments and you want to learn more about that. You can ask those questions if you want to. Also, learning about the team and having those questions set up means that when they're asking interview questions, you might get a better idea as to what they'd ask you, because if they're taking credit card payments, maybe understanding that process a little bit before going into the interview would be good. So let's talk about some of my experience in technical interviews. What I've learned is that the best technical interviews are people that write things down. So often, at least at Shopify, we end up usually like going through and giving you a Jamboard, and that gives the interviewer a chance to see what you're writing. That's really important. You can write it down on paper, but what's really nice about having it on a screen and having notes really does help. Because that way you're able to kind of like share your process and organize your thoughts a little bit better. You can write down the problem, the initial problem, so you can keep going back to make sure you're solving that initial problem. It just helps really structure things. And so we'll be doing that when we do our mock interview. Jenny will be writing it all out and making sure that she's comfortable with the problem and making sure she's answering everything and has everything organized on the screen. But before we get to that mock, let's make sure we talk about some common mistakes. And I would say one of the biggest common mistakes that I see is people not asking questions. They make assumptions right off. They don't ask those questions. They're never, they make assumptions, they lead a certain way, and they're just not, they're not engaging, they're not making sure that they understand the full problem. And it's hard sometimes as an interviewer to kind of direct them on track if they just keep making assumptions down the road. So make sure you ask questions. The other thing is you want to make sure you're answering the question. I know that seems pretty basic, but sometimes the question comes into different parts, right? And you want to make sure you've answered all those parts. I actually had a case where one of the parts of the question, the gentleman who I was interviewing felt that part of the question was just too hard and he wasn't even going to add that in, when that was part of the question. We wanted you to answer that part of the question. So make sure you're answering that part of the question. And again, don't make assumptions. I know I kind of mentioned this with the ask questions, but don't make assumptions. Always ask if you're not sure, or if you need to kind of make an assumption to help get to your point, make the assumption, but give reasoning for it if you're going to make those things. Oh, I have a question. What should you do when you find yourself having made a mistake in your work? That's a really good question. It is always okay to double back on your work in an interview. I know from experience that I've often realized at one point, like, oh, wait, there's actually a big flaw in the way that I'm doing this. This is how I would do it instead. And that's really important. That's what they're looking for. If you have a problem that you're trying to solve and it's really big and you realize you go down a path and you realize you've made a mistake, doubling back and saying, oh, that's actually wrong. Let me fix this. That's a really good thing that they're looking for. I know I would want to hire someone who admits they're wrong when they are wrong and are able to kind of move forward and push themselves into the right direction. So good question. So now we're going to kind of get into this mock interview, if that's okay with you. So we'll have Jenny join me back on screen. We're also going to, I brought some props because I want you guys to see how an interview is processed and not break the concentration of Jenny, but indicate some of the things she's doing really well in the interview. I brought a couple props to help me. So I have the first one, which is thinking out loud. So it's meant to be my little thought bubble of think out loud. I now have a repeat one. So if she is repeating the question so she understands, she's got it here. And then finally, when she asks a question, because I want to encourage you guys to ask questions in interview, I'll put this big question mark. So she's asking questions. So yeah, let's start with that. So Jenny was prepared with a Jamboard session. Usually your interviewer would have this, but Jenny has it now. And I will start with the question. Jenny, do you feel ready? Do you feel nervous? How do you feel?
Yeah, I'm ready. Let's do this.
Perfect. That's the attitude I like. Okay. So my interview question is, so Jenny, I'm going to ask you to build me an app. It's a volunteer-based app, and the app needs to do three things. It needs to, one, suggest volunteer or local volunteer opportunities that match the user's interest and schedule. It's got to, two, track their contributed volunteer hours, and three, allow the users to communicate with volunteer organizations.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, this would have been super helpful back when I was in high school because I would have to do volunteer hours and I would always have trouble like finding opportunities. So this is really great. So I guess we're creating a volunteer app and it has to do a couple of things that you mentioned. So let me get some notes down here so I don't forget. You have to first, I guess, suggest opportunities based on schedule. And I think you mentioned something else, but
yeah.
I
mentioned interests. So it's based on, so it says suggest local volunteer opportunities that match the user's interest and their schedule.
Awesome. Okay. And then the second one was, I think it was tracking volunteer hours. And the third one, I believe, was somehow having communication between the user and the organization in the app, right?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, awesome. Communication between user and org. Okay, awesome. So you mentioned and creating an app. What device are you thinking this should be used for? Like, should this be like on a phone or like a website, like a web app? What are
Great
your
question.
thoughts on that?
You know what? I'm going to let you decide which devices you expect to use this app. So whatever you're comfortable with.
Cool. My first thought is probably a mobile app because I'm thinking if I'm someone going to one of these opportunities, I'll probably have my phone and especially we want to track volunteer hours, probably want your phone on hand to make sure when you're starting your opportunity and ending it. And one other thing I just thought of is location tracking. So if we also want to suggest opportunities, you probably want to be pretty close to that opportunity as well. Okay, I guess where I probably want to start off is like a good starting point is maybe just going through the general flow of a user trying to find an opportunity. How does that sound?
That sounds great. Good starting point. Good question.
Yeah. So I guess when you first go onto the app, probably want to register as a volunteer because it's nice to have a profile because then you're able to track the number of hours you're doing and probably see the events that you are scheduled to volunteer for. So when you're registering, probably want some information like your name and like probably a password to log into the app. Let me think. Probably a phone number would be helpful. Just some basic info and and since you want to suggest opportunities based on schedule interest, probably want to also store those somehow. I guess, um, could you elaborate on like what's like schedule is like based on availability, or um, how would you think that would look like just like suggesting when they're not available or when they are?
I'll let that be a creative freedom that you can decide. So you can either do based on availability or based on unavailability or whatnot. So that's up to you.
Okay. um I
But
feel like
I will ask you a bit of a question now. I
okay.
see that you've collected a bunch of information from the user, but what if there are two users with the same phone number, they have the same home phone number, or two users with the same name? How would you determine which one is which?
Oh, that is a good question. Um, hmm. Maybe either adding some more information that could make them unique from each other. So maybe like even an email, or I guess one thing in I guess in computer sciences, the concept of IDs. So each ID has to be different from the from well, a user ID must be different from other users. So we can just use that as well. So I'll put that down too. Yeah.
Perfect.
Were we talking about schedules before that? I kind of forgot.
Yeah, that's okay. We can move on to the schedule stuff afterwards. Let's talk about your organizations now, because you need to
Okay.
also have organizations, right? Or else you wouldn't
Mhm.
be able to communicate between users and the organization. So let's move on to our organizations.
Yeah. So prob probably need to, as you mentioned, store some things for the organization as well. Um, Again, probably there's a name for the organization, and if to determine if like the user is interested in volunteering for said organization, it'd be nice for the organization to also have like a description, and probably an email would also be helpful. I know one of the requirements is to have communication in the app, but it's
Mhm.
also nice to have an email just in case maybe you can't the app doesn't work for some reason, or there's another way to contact the organization.
Yeah, especially actually if you're thinking of like maybe contacting them for something outside of the app, so outside of volunteer hours, that having an email would be really good.
Mhm. Exactly. Um, And I just thought, since the same problem with users can occur, like having an ID for the organization could help as well, just distinguishing between different organizations if they all have the same name for some reason.
That's a really good point. Very good point.
Yeah. I think that's it for the organization. I guess when the user like registers with all of that information, and an organization can create a volunteer opportunity. So I guess on the organization side, once they filled out their name, description, email, and probably have like a profile associated. So probably have a probably store a photo as well. That would be pretty cool. And have the name, description, and maybe on the bottom of the screen, you can have like a plus button for them to create an event. Feel like that's pretty cool for them to have. And also want to create some events, and we probably want to store information about the event as well. Um, so the event, since we're tracking volunteer hours, probably would like start like the time of the event, so that can account for start and end. The location of the event probably would be helpful. And if we're suggesting volunteer opportunities, it'll be nice to also see which opportunities are closer. And oh yeah, and like I guess the name of the event, because probably want to know what the event is. And I guess since I mentioned that, like a description would be nice too. Yeah. Not sure if I think that's all I want to store for now. Probably might be missing one or two things, but I think this would work, generally work.
Yeah, well, let's talk about how would you match the user to those events?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So when the user, I guess, logs in, I'm thinking when they log in, they'll have probably a list of opportunities. So like opportunity number 1, or oh, that's not a great one. 2 and 3. So like once they log in, just have a list. That's what I'm thinking.
And how would you rank those lists? What would you put at the top to make sure that it catches the attention of the user?
Okay. So I think we have a couple of factors here. So we have schedule, interest, and so I guess I kind of want to also add location at the end, but for now, what I'm thinking is as someone, I don't want to see opportunities that like I can't go to at all. So times when I'm unavailable. So I feel like those should be ordered near the end. And for interest, probably I guess the ones that have the most common interest with me and the organization will work. But I guess like I'm also wondering.
So would the interests be ranked on, because you've got the user indicates what interests they have. How would the program know to match the user with which events or which organizations?
Could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, good question. So you can basically, what I'm asking is that you've got the users have a set of interests that you've indicated. Mm-hmm. So there's a data point with a set of interests. But then there's nothing in organizations or events to match that. Are you pulling that information from the description? How are you determining if an event matches that user's interests?
Oh, that is a good question. I think I'm missing that in events. So it'll be really helpful for when like an organization creates events, also attach their interest. Let me just add that back in. Yes. So interest. And I guess while we're on the track of interest, what are you looking for interest? I have like 2 different thoughts on that. One is like a hashtag approach, because I know a lot of social media apps, especially like Twitter, like once you write a post, you can also associate hashtags with it to see like what it is about. And the other one is like a predefined set of categories. Yeah, I'm not sure which one is better.
Well, I do kind of like the hashtag approach. I think that's really creative and really fun. But what are some pros and cons about each of those? So we can kind of determine which is better.
Mm-hmm. So like for the hashtags, hashtag one, that is pretty easy. Like once you finish an event, you can just add what the like different tags, like hashtag like tree planting or something like that, and it's known to be successful. But I guess the downside of that is like organizations can just write whatever they want, and a problem I can see is like there's so many different hashtags and a user can't really find it could be too specific.
Yeah,
And
discoverability might be hard too, right?
yeah,
On that same
exactly.
line.
And like like for like a predefined a set of categories that solves that problem, but maybe there is like a category missing that we don't know of, but I can see that maybe the organization can just contact us using like a form on the app to like possibly introduce a category. So that could work. I think I like that better.
That does seem like a simpler approach. I'm also thinking that one of the downfalls of hashtags is an organization might misspell a hashtag, right? And then it's really hard to find that event from that. So I think that's a good call. Let's go with the preset, the simplified one, preset interests.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So let's kind of jump into tracking volunteer hours. How would that look like on your app?
Yeah, I think when a user, I'm thinking with the list of opportunities, there is just like a button where you can press join, and maybe you can have a list of events that you're participating in. And when it comes time to do that, when the time of the opportunity comes along, there could be a check-in button instead of the join. So you press it, and I guess it'll start tracking your hours. You can also, I know some opportunities require like the organization to make sure that you're starting at the time you're starting at, or so maybe they also want to attach a signature on this check-in time. I'm not sure. Another way that is more stress-free is, as I mentioned before, maybe like when you're at the location, your phone can has location tracking. So once you're in like a specific vicinity, um, it can just automatically start tracking if you forget. So that might be something we could do later on, because that might be a little bit more complicated.
Yeah. Well, what
But
if
yeah.
So let's go with you're dealing with location and you're getting close to the place that you're supposed to check in at. You press the button saying that you're going to check in. But what if you're going to a place that has no internet or no Wi, like no data? What if you're planting trees in an area with no data, and how would you check in then?
That's a good question. I think on phones, the time would still work without data. So when the time comes, the app will know like when to check in, and um, it wouldn't be on sync with the rest of the system, and it'll just track on your local phone. And once the volunteer opportunity ends, the check out button would be available, or it will be available whenever after you check in. And once you press
Okay.
that, the hours would be saved. But once you go online, that information from the local phone would be synced back to our system. So the information would be saved that way. On another hand, like another thing is that you can have access hopefully to a phone, so you can also just after event the get the organizer to manually input those hours in. Yeah.
Perfect. Now let's talk about communication between the user and the organization.
Okay. Yeah. Something I forgot on, since we were talking about hours, it'll be cool. It'll make sense to also store the hours with the users. So once you finish an opportunity, just add to the total amount of hours you have.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay. So communication between the user and the organization. So I uh, when um, when there's an opportunity, I guess you can click on the opportunity, and I'll probably attach somewhere to the organization's page. Also think probably have somewhere where you can have like a chat button, and like a lot of social media apps like Instagram and Facebook have like just a regular chat feature where you between the user and the organization just have like chat interface, so you can type your message and it'll show up. And we probably want to store some information so we can get back to the get back to the messages. So a chat, you would have the probably the user ID, since we have that stored, organization ID, and just probably like a list of messages, and each message would have like a timestamp, who sent it, and the content, I'm assuming.
Nice. Perfect. And so what happens if, so let's kind of go back to the like suggesting volunteer opportunities and how that workflow would happen. So are you kind of anticipating or expecting that there is a max number? So let's say this volunteer organization wants to have 10 people come and plant trees in their park. How would they know which people to pick? How would they know, like, how are you defining or allowing those organizations? Are they deciding people, or is it a first come first serve? Did I explain that correctly, or do you understand my question?
I think I understand. So what you're saying is like, if we have an event, and basically how do we decide which volunteers are going to be in that event? I can see like for the first come first serve basis, that could be pretty easy, because maybe in the event you can store the max number of volunteers, and like once, or like a counter for the number of users, and once it gets to 0, reaches the max, the join button would be not available, or the whole opportunity wouldn't be available, unless I'm thinking maybe someone could drop out, and maybe there could be a waitlist function as well, or it could be unavailable. But those are some options we can do. But going back on track, the other option could be good as well. Maybe because maybe there are a lot of volunteers interested, and maybe, of course, the organization would probably want the best qualified volunteers. So maybe when they're creating the event, having them choose which one is better, and we can store like which one they prefer, the max number, or where you can choose, I guess. Yeah.
Nice. There's like a choice on whether you apply, or whether it's a first come first serve opportunity. Maybe whether waitlist opportunities come up or not, or allow that. Nice.
Yeah.
You did mention qualified. How would an organization know whether someone is qualified?
That is maybe based on their interests. You can see if their interests match the events and the organization. So I guess when so a user like joins or applies, and when an organization is designing, maybe they'll click on an event and see all of the applications. Something I think I'm missing is like the one way where a user wants to see if an organization is best suited for them. Maybe the user could also have like a bio or something, so the organization can see, oh, like so and so has these interests, they're really passionate about this, and something else that I just thought of is maybe when they're joining or applying, the user can also have the option to like write a little blurb on why it would be nice to volunteer at this place when they apply, I guess.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a couple more questions based on this topic as well. So let's imagine you're a art gallery and you have two different types of events. You need sometimes people just to hang around the art gallery to make sure that someone's kind of babysitting the artwork. But then every once in a while, once a month, there's a new show that comes in and you need somebody to help you with the opening. The vernissage is what we call it in the art world. So the opening event. But at this opening event, you also have wine being served. How would an organization know who they're allowed to bring in to have this wine being served? Because there's usually different qualifications for that, right? So how would you know when the users are applying to this job or applying to this opportunity, whether or not they're actually qualified?
Oh, okay. So just to reiterate on your example, so if there is art gallery event and someone is serving wine and you want some volunteers just to look after the work, I'm assuming the volunteers must be like of age or older to be in the vicinity. Is that correct?
Well, to serve wine, you would definitely need to be of age. But you probably, if you're just babysitting artwork, you probably wouldn't have to be of age for that.
Okay. So, okay. So
that was a good question.
Thanks. So what qualifications for this example would the volunteers need? I think I missed that.
Yeah, so I was kind of asking a little bit what you expect those qualifications to be. So I know in Ontario, for example, you would need what's called a smart serve in order to serve alcohol, but you also need to be of a certain age. And so right now you're not collecting either of those information as to whether or not maybe you need a certificate or anything like that, and whether or not you're old enough, right? So would you think those would be really good points to maybe add into both the users and the request of like what the events were, like what was maybe needed?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So like probably just simply we can just add that to the description. But as you mentioned, this could be like common enough for like many events. So just like a list of qualifications, I guess, would be cool. And those could be like the interests, where it could be we can set predefined qualifications, and if like the user brings up like, oh, I have this that I think many people would also have, we can request that, or there could be just like a other section for anything that they want to bring up.
Yeah, because you definitely wouldn't want, if you were 16 and you kept getting a bunch of events popping up on your list that was also for 18 plus or 19 plus because they were serving alcohol at an event, that wouldn't be great, right?
Yeah.
But then some jobs are better suited for high school students and volunteering for high school students to collect your volunteer hours. So
exactly. Yeah, that's a nice addition to add.
Oh, just curious, what kind of jobs would the interview be modeling? Like app designer or a user interface? So that is a really good question. Typically in technical interviews, you'd be kind of working more on the technical questions. So it's like, as Jenny has shown here, and we're kind of actually at the point where we are wrapping up this technical interview. So, but as she's kind of explaining here, she's kind of breaking down the different data, like the different points and pieces of data that she would be collecting. So if you were applying for a job as a designer, you wouldn't be doing this part of the app. So you wouldn't be doing a technical interview. Technical interviews are more for the engineering side. So thinking about the logic and how this works. And so that's kind of what she's going through now and understanding. And that's what the questions I have is like, have you thought of this approach? Have you thought of that approach? Did I answer your question?
And like something I want to add to that is in engineering, there's different types of roles you can interview for. So somewhere like if you want to interview more like back end, more logic, more like what we're storing, you're probably doing more of like what I've done, like having like a list of things that you want to store for a user and how that connects with the organization and the event. But stuff more UI focused, like people coding up like interfaces, they'll kind of be more like screen drawing and more, I guess, not focused on the models too much.
Yeah, and that's actually also another good point, is that there's lots of different types of technical jobs, and so each one will be kind of linked more to what you are focused on. So if you are doing the backend, this is more of like a backend interview, but also make sure when you're looking at what is kind of expected of you. So if you're going into an interview where coding isn't a requirement, so I know in Dev Degree, for example, if you ever applied to Dev Degree, which is the program that I graduated from and Jenny's currently in their questions, in their interviews, you don't need to actually have any programming experience. And so the technical interview is a whiteboarding interview like this, where you're able to talk through. And it's really interesting and good to bring in other examples. Like as Jenny kind of put at one point, she's like, I know there's a lot of apps that have messaging options in there. And so that's where she was able to pull examples from her day to day and use that. But she never wrote any code. And that's kind of important to indicate. It's good to understand how the logic would work in your code, but you don't actually have to write code in whiteboarding interviews. The next question is, oh wait, actually, I just make sure, thank you. I was asking because I'm interested in user interfaces. Yeah, so if you're doing more user interface stuff, then you're probably gonna, like, depending on if you're doing, there's, I guess, two different ways you could be doing user interfaces. There's the designers, and then there's also the front end developers. And so if you're becoming a front end developer, that's more, you'd be doing a technical interview, but it'd be a little bit more oriented on not so much the designing of it, but understanding the logic of how you'd connect buttons and whatnot. And how do you best prepare for a technical interview? Definitely do as many questions as you possibly can. Ask your friends to help build apps. There's also a lot of great resources. If you Google whiteboarding interview questions, they're usually popping up. But I think some of the best ones are understanding how to build and design an app. So just start thinking that way. So another example is like, could you mimic and understand and think about how Pokemon Go was done, or how TikTok is done? Like what kind of data points would you need for TikTok? And if you can start kind of mapping out what you would need to create the logic of TikTok, or what you would need to create the logic of Twitter, or what you would need the logic of Instagram, or maybe Uber Eats, if you like to eat out a lot. If you start thinking of those problems, then that's a really good way of like practicing. It's just trying to think about the logic behind all the apps that you use on a daily basis.
Yeah, and something like great about practicing is you can find a friend that's also in the process of interviewing, and you can do it to each other, and you can also like be an interviewer, and that also really helps just to like feel like how an interviewer actually feels like during an interview, and like also think of questions that the interviewer might ask. That's also pretty helpful to do.
Yeah, so good resources. Like I said, I've used examples from online before, so I just Googled whiteboarding interview questions. And there's usually a bunch of options there. I know I've looked at YouTube videos for that too when I was preparing. So I don't have any particular resources to send you to, but there are lots out there online. But organizations that help offer mock interviews, that would be really, really fun. I wish that existed. At least I don't know about it. Maybe someone else does. But that would be a really great way of doing things. But like Jenny said, practicing with a friend is a really good way of doing it. Or ask your family or friends to maybe suggest building an app. I've had a really great job of having some mentorship along the ways that I've been able to utilize and ask them to help me when I'm prepping for that. So hopefully that helps. I know it's not as good of an answer as I would like to give. How should you approach an interview if this is your first job and you don't have any professional technical experience yet? Good question, Terry. So as I've kind of mentioned with the dev degree program, because you don't actually need any technical experience to get in, the way that I would recommend doing that is definitely do what we've said, right? We want to repeat the question, you want to think out loud, and you want to ask lots of questions. But start with using experiences that you know. So Jenny actually had experience, I know, and volunteering, and she knew kind of some of the things that a volunteer organization would do. So it's like, here are some examples of things I do know. Maybe start to if you are better at understanding UI and you mostly work with building and looking at apps, maybe say, this is kind of how I would picture drawing my app. This is what it would look like. And then from there go, okay, in order for this to appear, I want that photo. So that photo needs to be a data point. I need to also be collecting information like their name, their phone number, and start to kind of break it down so that you have those views, but also those data points that you're collecting. But don't worry about having the right answers. I guess that's the big thing. I know the technical experience is hard. How do you recover when you make big mistakes during a technical interview? As I mentioned, definitely make sure you kind of backtrack and go, oh, actually, that was wrong. This is how I would approach this instead. Understanding how someone thinks is really what we're looking for when we're doing interviews. And so if you are asking, or if you are going down the wrong path and you realize that at one point, instead of continuing down that path, stop and go, actually, did I answer that question? Maybe this isn't the best approach. Kind of as we talked through with Jenny when we used that example of the interests. She's like, I've got 2 approaches for this. And my suggestion was, hey, let's talk about some of the pros and cons about those. If you start talking about the pros and cons and you go, actually, the hashtag one has a lot of problems to it. It has a lot of potential errors that could come up. I'm going to go with the simpler approach and just do the interest. So that's a really good way of, because it's not about having the right answer. It's about explaining your thought process and getting comfortable to a solution that you like and being okay saying, you know what, that wasn't the right approach. This is probably better and here's why. Always say why. I should have had a why button. I should have a why. If you mentioned that should have been one of my props. How long do you think it would take to prepare for a big interview? I'm always preparing. So that's like the more practice you do, the more comfortable you are. You're always going to be nervous in an interview. I know I'm even nervous interviewing. Jenny, I'm sure you've been nervous in interviews before. Yeah. She shakes her head. No, I've never been nervous. So the more you practice, the less nervous you kind of do become. But constantly also being aware of, if you're doing a technical interview, being aware of technologies that are coming into play. Not so much the technology, but using apps as examples. So Jenny could have easily been like, oh, I use Google Calendar a lot when I'm doing schedule stuff. So maybe I would want to do a calendar approach, and I would want people to indicate on their calendar how that schedule is built up. Or maybe when I talked about, asked her questions about the, who would be better qualified, maybe she'd say, oh, you know what? Having a user rating system might be really interesting, kind of like how Uber rates their drivers and their riders. That's another really interesting approach, and we could kind of go off on a tangent and understand that problem a little bit better. And so you can kind of get a sense as to how interviews can go a bunch of different ways. So even if you're exploring the same interview question over and over again, you can, with different interviewers, have totally different results in your end. So the more you practice, the better it is. There's not a set amount of time.
Yeah, and something to add about comfortability is that some people just apply to jobs that they're not particularly interested in just to get that interview experience. So when there is a big opportunity coming up, like a big interview, you have so many other interviews on your belt, and take that and go with it.
That is a very good point. Yeah. Any other questions coming your way? These are great. I love the questions. Wait a second to see if anything else pops up. Where did you find the typing cat gif? So I know most of the time we use, it's like Giffer, or there's the website.
Giphy.
Giphy, like,
yeah.
and so I'll just search in things for that. But it's one that we use quite a lot at Shopify, actually.
Yeah, we love our emojis and gifs.
What about other non-technical aspects about preparing for an interview, like researching the company you're applying for and other things like that? That's a really good question. So we focus more on the technical interview when we're talking about this, but there are a lot of other non-technical aspects to an interview. And each company is doing something slightly different on that aspect as well. And so you might want to look into first, like, what is the company? I've had it before where I've entered an interview and somebody has been like, oh, I know nothing about Shopify. What did they do? That's not necessarily the best start to an interview, right? You want to make sure you understand who you're applying to, because not only do we want to make sure you're the right candidate for us, but you also should make sure that you're going to a job that you want, and that's a company that you can get behind. And so it's good to kind of know who you're applying or who you're going with. I've also had it the other way where somebody has known a lot about me, because you typically find out who you're getting interviewed by, and they did a bunch of research and knew things about me that I didn't even realize were still on the internet. So you are allowed to Google your interviewers and the company and everything like that. So feel free to do that. And always come with questions. That's really, really important. Because if you're asking questions, that shows that you're also engaged and you're interested. Jenny, do you have any other tips for that?
Yeah, no, just like really know the company. Well, not really know, but like be passionate about it, what they do, their purpose. And yeah, questions is always a must. It's always awkward at the end of an interview when I don't have any questions and there's just this awkward silence, and the interviewer thinks that I'm not really interested in the company or working for it.
Yeah. Is there any place I can find practice questions for interviews? So like I kind of said, I usually just search online because I like to have a broad sense, because you never know what you're going to get on, like, it's not always just one type of interview question. So it's really good to just Google and get a broad sense as to what a bunch of people are asking. And then that way you're better prepared. It kind of makes it a little bit more random and not just focused from one company. I mean, if one company's published the questions they ask, you can do that, but feel free to use actually, as a developer, and Jenny can probably attest to this too, we use Google all the time. It is like one of our favorite things.
Further onto your career, you'll probably be hit with like coding questions and algorithms, and there's a lot of websites that help you practice doing those. I think like LeetCode might be one of them. I haven't used it personally, but there's a lot of websites that help you practice for like actually coding algorithms and questions like that.
Yeah, so the next one is LinkedIn a useful tool? Yeah, so definitely a useful tool for making connections. Also, I mostly use it before I go into an interview, whether it's researching the person that's interviewing me, looking at the company and what they're showing on LinkedIn, but also seeing if I know anybody at that company that I can talk to. I've had before where people have reached out to me because they're like, hey, I know that you've done the dev degree program and I'd love to learn a little bit more. Is it possible we can meet for a coffee? Sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not, depending on their schedule. But LinkedIn can be definitely a useful tool on getting to know the organization, the interviewers, but also seeing if you have any connections with anybody in that organization so that you can better prepare and better get a sense as to what they're doing. Yeah, so Kate said that she liked the using LinkedIn to see company profile page, which is really good. You get a lot from that experience. Yeah. So the next question is, how frequently are the puzzle type questions on interviews? So that is a, like, it depends on the company, I guess I'm going to say. Like, that is definitely something that does pop up. But some companies are, and it also depends on the level that you're applying for. So as you get higher up into problems, or higher up into um, like higher positions, you'll probably see a little bit more of those puzzle style questions. We definitely, like, if you're applying for dev degree, we wouldn't give you that kind of puzzle style, and it's usually not considered like a whiteboarding. Sometimes, actually, I shouldn't say that completely. But whiteboarding in general at Shopify is not usually the puzzle type questions. My coding experience, when I did my coding interview, that was more of a puzzle style question when I was doing it at Shopify. But again, I was a little bit higher up than where you guys would start in your process. So my career had already started, and I was already programming and learning a lot more. So I wouldn't say like it's dependent. I know it's the like typical question, like it depends. So I'm sorry I don't have a full answer for that, but it definitely depends on the company, and it depends on the level of position you're interviewing for.
Britta, could you just elaborate or clarify what a puzzle type question is?
Yeah, good. So a puzzle type question, usually there are a bunch of these different questions that you can find online where maybe there's like, I'm trying to use an example. So maybe they're asking you to build an app that works a certain way, but there is like an optimal way of solving that problem. And they kind of trick you into thinking to go one path, but then it ends up being like, once you start to kind of work it through and think out loud, because you got to be thinking out loud, then you'll start to kind of find your way into answering that problem. So the problem has more of a right or wrong answer, or has more of an optimal answer, maybe is the best way of putting it. But those tend to be those puzzle style ones. And I would say if it is a puzzle style question where there is more of a like correct answer, usually that process of getting to that puzzle question is really important. And that's what the interviewer is looking for. It's less about the actual answer. You mentioned asking questions to the interviewer. What type of questions can we ask? Is there better to ask more general questions, like what your typical workday, or specific things about the company? That is totally up to you. I've had all sorts of questions, and it's when you're given the chance to ask questions to the interviewers, that's usually a chance for you to figure out if this is the right position for you. Because not only are we interviewing to see if you're the right position for us, it goes vice versa, right? We want to make sure, like when you're interviewing, you want to make sure that you're going to a place you want to be going to and you're comfortable going to. So some of the questions that I've asked in the past is, what does your day-to-day look like? Do you ask for feedback often? How does work, maybe like if I'm a developer in the program or a developer in the on a team, maybe I'll ask, what's your relationship with the designers? What's the relationship with the project manager? So I can understand what my relationship with some of the other people on the team would be. How do you measure success on your team? These are questions to ask if you want.